Good morning and welcome to First Unitarian Church. I'm Bev Baker, my husband Bill and I, longtime members who've enjoyed the warmth and the wisdom and the volunteerism and the love in this community. It's also my pleasure to welcome Reverend Dennis McCarty back to our pulpit. I always appreciated that during our year without a minister, he gave us some stability and a good ministerial presence. So, welcome back. Our mission is to welcome all with love, to support learning and spiritual growth, to serve our wider community, and to work for justice, equity, and inclusion. In that spirit, we acknowledge that we live and worship on land of the Mi'kmaq Shawnee people, who were the descendants of the ancient mound builders. Now, please make sure to read the announcements in the inserts in today's order of service, where you can find important information regarding accommodations and upcoming events. The flowers this morning are given by Angela Pruitt to celebrate the birthdays of two wonderful ladies, Jean Rowling and Martha Walker. So now it's time to greet our neighbors. So before we begin our service, let's take a moment to wave to the people watching from home. I hope Jean is one of those. And then rise and greet our neighbors and say hello. When you hear the singing bowl ring, please return to your seats. So you want to turn and, I don't know what I do. There we go. Hello, everybody. So, greet your neighbors, please. Our chalice lighter this morning is Angela Pruitt. Come and enter this beloved community. Let its spirit fill your soul. Let its fellowship bring you comfort. Let yourself rest in its sacred time and space. Take refuge here, grow here, Be challenged here. Enter this beloved community. Come. All right, our first hymn this morning is number 354 in the gray hymnal. And please rise as you are able.
Once upon a time, a seeker arrived at a small community in the desert. Upon knocking, the doorkeeper answered and said, "Yes, what can I do for you?" "Wisdom," said the seeker. "I seek wisdom." "Oh," said the doorkeeper. "Well, do you know how to weave a basket?" "No," said the seeker. Well, if you want to stay here, you have to learn to weave a basket. We weave baskets here. And so the seeker stayed and worked and worked and worked until finally the seeker learned how to weave a basket. At which point, they were approached by the doorkeeper again. "Did you find what you were looking for?" asked the doorkeeper. "Well, I learned how to weave a basket, so if I find some wisdom, I can put it in here." "Oh," said the doorkeeper. "Well, I have a question for you then." Ooh, a question. The seeker held their breath. Could this be the question? The one that would give them all the answers they were searching for? "Okay," said the seeker. "Do you know how to grow mustard greens?" "What?" asked the seeker. "Well, we also grow mustard greens here, so if you're seeking wisdom, you can stay and with the others and learn how to grow mustard greens." The seeker wasn't quite sure what to do with that, but they decided they would stay and learn how to grow mustard greens, and they were not entirely convinced that this wasn't just a ploy from the community to get free labor, but they tried. And they did. They learned how to grow mustard greens. And then they were approached by the doorkeeper again. "Did you find what you were looking for?" asked the doorkeeper. "Well, I learned how to weave a basket and grew some mustard greens to put in it." "Oh," said the doorkeeper. "Well, let me ask you another question." "Wait a minute," said the seeker. "Now, I understand that to gain wisdom, you have to be open to learning, and that it takes time, and that you learn from other people. But, I just learned how to weave a basket and grow mustard greens. I don't know if I want to learn anything more." "Oh," said the doorkeeper. "Well, still, let me ask you, do you know how to make greens and garlic soup?" "What?" said the seeker. "Of course I know how to make greens and garlic soup. My grandparents and my parents taught me. I come from a village that's known for its soup." "Oh," said the doorkeeper. "Well, then can you teach us?" And that's where our story ends. I wonder if he taught him, and I wonder, why do you think I told this story? All right, children, if you want, you can join me in our classroom.
Well, I've brought along a piece of homework from when I was in div school, a hymn I wrote, 25 odd years ago, and we're sticking with that quarter note, half note, 3-beat rhythm. so it won't be too unfamiliar. Well, the last, this is the God's own face will never ever be found with weary feet on broken ground. We just do that at the very end. So you sing verse, 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 and then the ending piece. So away we go. It'll be an interesting morning. Just let you know, I'm still writing this sermon, so what you get is going to be very much a work in progress. But hopefully there'll be some information here that you haven't heard too many times. I took the reading this morning from a graduate philosophy course textbook, the Routledge Handbook of Epistemic Justice, and it's a pretty dense text. They are very attached to 75-cent words, but hopefully we can pick out some usable information here. It reads, in the era of information and communication, issues of misinformation and miscommunication are more pressing than ever. We need to remember to ask, who has a voice and who doesn't? Are voices interacting with equal agency and power? Who is being understood and who isn't, and who is being believed? Who is being acknowledged and engaged with? Epistemic injustice refers to those forms of unfair treatment that relate to issues of knowledge, understanding, and participation. And these issues include a wide range of topics concerning wrongful treatment and unjust structures, including the following: exclusion and silencing, being treated as though you were invisible, having your meanings or contributions systematically distorted, misheard or misrepresented, and or being marginalized as a result of dysfunctional dynamics, etc. The topic of epistemic injustice is a very rich one in at least three ways. The first is that it brings together many topics, debates, and traditions in philosophy. The second is that epistemic injustice connects to major social and intellectual movements such as feminism, hermeneutics, critical race theory, disability studies, and decolonializing queer and trans epistemology. So in sociological terms, it's very intersectional. You may have heard that word before. The third source of richness for epistemic injustice lies in the fact of its status as a pervasive feature of our social and professional lives. They're describing it with big words, but you see it everywhere you look if you learn to look for it. Unfortunately, the socio-historical context of the European philosophical traditions, in other words, what some people like to call the Western Enlightenment tradition, is rife with epistemic injustices, many of which have affected philosophy itself. Epistemic justice might therefore require not just closer engagement with philosophical traditions and ideas from the wider non-European world, but also a difficult form of critical thinking and self-examination, informed by feminist, post-colonial, decolonial, and critical race theories that might offer not only pluralism and perspective, but also epistemic justice. So, epistemic justice and Article 2, here we go. I'm going to begin with a question. Unitarian Universalist theologian James Luther Adams was our leading expert on covenants and covenantal theology. He taught that a covenant is a sincere, ethical promise willingly entered into by equals. And a covenant is rooted in love, not law. A religious covenant is rooted in love, not law. In other words, violation of a covenant is a problem not because it breaks an enforceable law, but because it is a violation of trust. It is a breach of faith. Some critics of the new value statement in our Unitarian Universalist Association bylaws complain about the use of the word accountability in our new covenantal language. Again, according to Adams, a covenant is rooted in love, not law. So, here's the question. If we're talking about love instead of law, what does accountability even mean? And to answer that question, I'm going to begin with a troubling story told by feminist philosopher Miranda Fricker about injustice. Late one spring evening in 1993, two young black men were waiting at a bus stop in a suburb outside London, England, and six white teenagers on the other side of the street began to shout at them. One of the black men, Dwayne Brooks, got scared and began to run. The white men charged across the street, caught Brooks's friend, Stephen Lawrence, and repeatedly stabbed him. And to Brooks's horror, Lawrence collapsed on the sidewalk and died. Police quickly arrived. They had a standing protocol for aiding violent crime victims and drawing out information about the crime. But in this case, the officers assumed they already knew what had happened, a gang fight. They assumed that rather than being victims of a deadly assault, the two black men had been willing participants. In other words, the police assumed that Brooks and Lawrence were themselves largely responsible for the violence inflicted against them. And while the police grabbed and interrogated Brooks, the white murderers got away. Witnesses quickly came forward to explain what had really happened. It turned out that this white gang had been on a rampage attacking black people that whole evening. Even so, 20 years would pass before the murderers were finally brought to trial. And it was so messed up that Parliament called for an inquiry, and they found that the officers had failed to provide aid to the crime victims. Dwayne Brooks had frantically tried to tell them what happened, but they ignored eyewitness accounts while the murderers got away. In philosophical terms, Brooks was a knower, K-N-O-W, knower. He knew what had happened, but because of bias against him as a black man, police refused to listen. Again, in philosophical terms, they did not accord him appropriate respect as a knower. The inquiry found that the root cause was, of course, entrenched structural racism in the London police force. Of course, this sort of thing happens all the time on both sides of the Atlantic. Black citizens here in the United States complain that they are treated differently by police, by other agencies, and even by the medical establishment. For the record, scientific research has confirmed these complaints. This is an example of what Miranda Fricker calls testimonial epistemic injustice. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we learn, what we learn, and all too often, as in this case, what we think we know that just isn't true, but which prevents us from finding out what we actually need to know. Testimonial injustice. Those are big words, but they describe something that really is all too common and very basic in human experience. The human brain uses all kinds of neural shortcuts unconsciously to process input and make decisions. Because we do this unconsciously, it is all too easy to find ourselves acting on cultural assumptions rather than facts. In the case of the Stephen Lawrence murder, biased police assumptions that this had been a gang fight because black men are all violent prevented police from listening to the real facts about the crime. We need to listen to people who are treated unfairly. Here's the Rutledge Handbook of Epistemic Injustice. You can see there's a palm on the cover, and in the middle of the palm it comes down to one word: listen, pay attention. So we need to listen. Whether it be an individual in an unequal relationship or a whole population. That's all testimonial justice really is. Listen to the marginalized. Listen, pay attention. There's another kind of epistemic injustice, what Fricker calls hermeneutical injustice, and that's a bit harder to explain. Hermeneutics, I love this. Hermeneutics is the science of interpretation. Most commonly, it's used in interpretation of sacred scriptures, particularly the Bible. But philosophically, Fricker also uses it for the interpretation of what we might call the sacred text of human knowledge and interaction. Knowledge and the tools for expressing knowledge can very much be a justice issue. In the 1800s, First Nations children, for example, were forced to be educated in so-called Indian reservation schools, usually operated by mainline religious traditions. And in these schools, the children had to eat so-called American food. They were not allowed to speak their native languages. They had to learn English, and they were not allowed to practice their own native religious traditions. And thus, their whole understanding of their own lives was taken away and reframed according to Euro-American standards. Hermeneutical injustice. That's what it looks like. And this brings us to what Miranda Fricker calls the necessary right to contest, the right to be heard if you feel you've been unfairly treated, or if you feel you're being denied information that you need. The right to contest she tells us, is a part of epistemic justice, and it fundamentally changes a relationship. The more powerful person in the relationship, the more privileged person, you might say, will act differently if they're accountable for their actions toward the less powerful, less privileged person. Remember that word? Accountable? That's what we're working on today. And there's a tension between what Fricker calls cultural domination, or a culture of domination on the one hand, versus the right to contest on the other. And one example she uses is in the United Kingdom, England, a law passed decades ago that made marital rape a crime. And she explains that even in a marriage where the husband would never even dream of committing marital rape, that law changed the institution of marriage. It weakened the patriarchal cultural domination of men and granted women a greater right to contest, the right to contest. And again, I apologize that we have to juggle these large and abstract words to discuss this in this academic language. These are really very basic and very personal issues. But it also brings us to the reason I'm sharing all this. Of course, epistemic justice does give us a really helpful lens to discuss the new language in the Article 2 UUA bylaws. And there's been a lot of debate, some of it is still going on, about why we even needed to add the values and all that covenantal language, and why the 7 principles were not enough anymore. Frankly, I just want to start by saying this may be a significant change as far as the bylaws are concerned, but it does not change much in the daily lives of Unitarian Universalists. Our 7 principles were never important because they were in our bylaws. They were important because they're in people's hearts. And they'll stay there as long as you want them there. The 7 principles have not been done away with, no matter what anyone tells you. I still like the 7 principles. They're still a handy introduction to a visitor, what we're about as a religious tradition. And now, if the visitor has kids, I brought a visual aid, I can say, hey, if you like the 7 principles, your kids are going to love this jet pig. Okay, JETPIG, that's the anagram somebody came up with for the values. Justice, equity, transformation, plurality, interconnectedness, and generosity with love at the center. There's a little heart on their vest there. I'm going to put the jet pig visual aid up there. Love at the center, jet pig. It is totally natural to be a bit nervous about a change that's fairly sizable and talked about a lot. But again, it does not change our week-to-week lives as Unitarian Universalists. The very nature of this faith is that each one of us still has to figure out for ourselves what the 7 principles mean in our lives, and it's also up to us to figure out for ourselves what those 7 values mean: justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, generosity, with love at the center. Hopefully I can help you with a little of that today. The opening statement of the new Article 2 language tells us, quote, "Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love." And I quite like that statement. You can really chew on it. There's sermons in there. What's not to like? But if we listen to the core opposition to the Article 2 revision, we do sometimes hear condemnation of that word, accountability. There are people who really don't like it, and I've even heard claims that the UUA is going to come in and take over congregations and do bad things to individual churches if we don't follow the UUA mandate, whatever the hell that may be. Frankly, that kind of talk just has no basis in fact. Even if the UUA wanted to control individual congregations, which they don't, it's way too much work and hassle, There's no mechanism to do it. For the record, that would require a rewrite of Article 3 in our bylaws, not Article 2. But that accountability piece does bring us back to epistemic justice, because to me, that's where accountability is going, practicing epistemic justice by actually listening to all voices and honoring the right to contest. We listen to the voices of the least among us as knowers, both in society and within our own religious tradition, and we live into the fact that there is always more for us to learn. We Unitarian Universalists often think of ourselves as an all-white Euro-American religious tradition, and we mostly are, but not totally. Nationwide, we have thousands of members, thousands who are Asian, Hispanic, Indigenous, and or Black. Class-wise, we think of ourselves as mostly white-collar class, and we are, but not totally. I come out of a blue-collar background, and so do thousands of other UUs. We have thousands of LGBTQ plus members. We have thousands of members with disabilities. And we need to listen to those experiences too. We need to listen to that knowledge. In an article about epistemic justice, Mexican sociologist Sylvia Schmelkes writes, quote, "The notion of lifelong, life-wide learning, I love that term, presupposes acknowledging the existence of very diverse sources of knowledge, many ways of knowing, and the need for dialogue as the principal method for ensuring both deep learning and personal and collective growth." Close quote. Diversity, dialogue, and personal and collective growth. So, how do we not just accept and tolerate one another, but really honor and engage the pluralism and diverse knowledge we already have among us? And that takes epistemic justice toward members and would-be members who are outside our cultural mainstream. And that lies right at the core of this bylaws revision. If I say something hurtful toward a transgender person or a black person or towards a woman, and I have done all those things in my life, it was unintentional, but even unintentionally, they should be able to tell me so. They should have that right to contest. I believe I'm religiously called to listen, and that's a crucial part of what accountability means to me. To me, the word accountability is an ethical call. I am called to be curious, to be interested in learning more about people unlike myself. Accountability ethically calls me to listen to people, particularly people in the margins. Accountability is the ethical practice of epistemic justice. And to me, if I do that, if I put a mind toward doing that, the pieces all start to fall into place. Here's one stark example of epistemic injustice in our own history. 200 years ago, you may have heard of this guy, Reverend William Ellery Channing was the leading Unitarian intellectual of his day. He wrote a lot. He wrote a book on the hottest moral issue of his time, slavery. And I've read that book. And frankly, today, it's hard to read that book without gagging. Channing accepted, the wealthy Boston intellectual white guy Channing accepted every rationalization for slavery that white slaveholders gave him. Brilliant though Channing was, it never occurred to him to ask an enslaved person what slavery was like for them. Testimonial injustice. He could not fathom that an enslaved person would know things about slavery and their own life that he, as a recognized intellectual, didn't. So, Our record in the UUA has been less than perfect on this point. It's not because we lack good intentions. We really have really good intentions. But the human condition is that, like Channing, we don't know what we don't know until we learn it. And that means somebody has to tell us. The whole 20th century history of this association, particularly when we've gathered at General Assembly, we have a track record of well-meaning but insensitive treatment of our more marginalized members. People of color, in particular, learned that there was no use talking about insensitive treatment because it was more likely to blow back on them than to be corrected. Testimonial injustice, failure to listen, and denial of the right to contest. And that results in, as Miranda Fricker terms it, cultural domination. Throughout the 20th century, without realizing it, we have been a culture of domination by straight, able-bodied Euro-Americans, and for the first 3/4 of the century, males such as myself. And it's not that we didn't care. It's just that we didn't know what we didn't know. I've done insensitive stuff again, and quite frankly, when someone tells me that I've said or done something insensitive as a straight Euro-American male, that can get uncomfortable. But the only way to move away from a culture of domination, whether it's intentional or unintentional, is to listen when someone tells us how our action affected their life. Accountability. That's pretty much all it is. We really only began documenting this problem in this generation. And it included staffing practices. Again, people of color particularly had a tough time both at the national level and in congregations. The first out gay ministers and the first black ministers in largely white UU congregations had a tough time, and some wound up leaving. If you're up on your recent Unitarian Universalist history, you probably know that things kind of came to a head in 2017. Just to take one more look, a Latina religious education director who lived in the southern region of the UUA was passed over for that region's lead executive position. The personnel director hired a white male minister who lived 1,000 miles away from the southern region and was told he would not have to relocate. Now, any objective observer looking at the big picture would see that as a suboptimal hiring process. And it blew up nationally, not because it was uniquely bad, it wasn't, but because resentment had been building among Unitarian Universalist professionals of color for decades. We had a long record of inconsistent hiring and insensitive treatment and epistemic injustice toward people of color, among others, and denial of the right to contest. With no right to contest questionable actions, resentment does build, and conflict quite naturally, sooner or later, result. And we've been working to figure out these dynamics and fix them ever since. But we don't know what we don't know until someone tells us. Beloved though our 7 principles are, they're a product of the 1980s. They don't take into account what we've learned in the past 40 years about right relations and the diversity that's already among us. The very concept of epistemic injustice did not even exist as such when we ratified the 7 principles. We've learned a lot in those 40 years, and shame on us if we hadn't. We've learned a lot. The new values and the new covenantal language are just no more than the next step in our evolving understanding of one another. And I'm glad we took that next step. Human learning is one of the coolest things about us. And I love what happens when we take a hard look at how we've always done things and how we could do better. The study of epistemic justice gives us a language to understand what we've been groping at for the last 20 years. Our understanding of the world always is evolving. We need to keep learning new ways of evolving with it. Society's biggest problems come when people refuse to adapt to new information. And that's epistemic injustice in a nutshell. So, may we continue to evolve as our knowledge and language evolve, even when it's not quite as comfortable as we'd like. Amen. May it be so. Okay, I won't throw this one away. I'll try to get it right this time. I'm going to invite you to close our service by joining in our closing hymn. Stand as you're willing and able. We'll sing number 128, The Fire of Commitment. Oh, I'm sorry, 1028. I'm sure glad you all can sing. Before we go out, I believe you've got the principles all on your back wall, the whole list, including the 8th principle? Okay, it's worth checking out because really it's the shoot from which Article 2 grew. I've talked to Paula Cole-Jones about this, and then that's very much embodied in Article 2.
Because of you, we passed it 100% a year ago.
Yay for y'all. You obviously have the fire of commitment. We venture into unforeseen futures sustained by the strengths but also sapped by the weaknesses which have ever shaped our species. But a blessing whispers into the ear of anyone who will listen. We did not invent love. It was love that invented us. So let us go forth, therefore, and love wrapped in such a love that no human power can forestall it. Shalom, salam, blessed be, and amen. And the chalice is extinguished. May that light go with us into the world.